We have a crowd here. There are three of them.
Yeah.
Three's a crowd, right?
Welcome, everybody. Can I get, I'm not seeing video, but if someone could write into the chat who's remote and let me know if you can hear me. Yes, okay, great. So I'm going to share my screen. My name is Todd, and I'm the first presenter. And I'm going to be talking today about this paper, which has kind of a long title. So we'll go through that. It's called The Primacy of Intention and the Duty to Truth, a Gandhi-inspired argument for retranslating Himsa and Ahimsa with connections to history, ethics, and civil resistance. And this is an extended version of a chapter that's going to appear in a forthcoming book edited by Vinod Kool and Rita Agrawal called Gandhi's Wisdom. It should be out early next year from Palgrave Macmillan. And I have posted the full paper, the extended version, on my website at web.stanford.edu/Davies. And I would very much welcome comments either during the session or afterward. So the spirit of the paper, this is a quote from Gandhi, and it's in the paper, is one that I really like from him. He wrote in 1936, "There is no such thing as Gandhism. The opinions I have formed and the conclusions I have arrived at are not final. I may change them tomorrow. I have nothing new to teach the world. Truth and nonviolence are as old as the hills. All I have done is to try experiments in both on as vast a scale as I could do. In doing so, I have sometimes erred and learned by my errors. Life and its problems have thus become, to me, so many experiments in truth and nonviolence. By instinct, I have been truthful, but not nonviolent." So I really resonate with this quote because, to me, what Gandhi is showing here is that he has what I consider to be the heart of a scientist. Even though he's associated with anti-rationalism, there's a kind of provisionality, an unselfishness, an unwillingness to take on the role of guru or of somebody whose pronouncements should be taken as gospel. And so that's the spirit here, because although I wrote this chapter for a book called Gandhi's Wisdom, and I think there's a great deal of wisdom in Gandhi, as I'm going to say, there are some choices that Gandhi made in the ways that he translated into English some of his core concepts that I think we might want to rethink for the 21st century. And I come at this not as a Gandhi scholar, not as a Sanskrit scholar, but as somebody who has read into this through the work of other scholars and a lot of dictionary definitions and done some linguistic analysis to arrive at the conclusions that I've given to you. So I want to give a kind of overview of the paper in a few slides here that will give you the general argument, or the things that I think are the most important takeaways. And this will make more sense for those who are familiar with Gandhi. After that, I'll go into some of the highlights from the paper itself. So we're at about 100 years since Gandhi roughly introduced the term nonviolence in 1920. And so a lot of the paper is about looking at where we are with that word in 2021. What I want to say is that it's become harder over time, especially in the last 30, 40 years, to convincingly characterize anyone or their actions as nonviolent. And the reason for this is that the scope of what is meant by violence has expanded through concepts such as structural violence, which of course comes from peace studies. I think it's one of the great achievements of the field that many more people understand and we need to look at an expanded scope for what we consider violence. But that has consequences for what it means to be nonviolent, right? That's first key point. The second point is that the word violence itself, and this is a point that's gone through in much more detail in the paper than I'm going to have time for today, facilitates a focus on what can be observed, independent of what is knowingly intended. And in fact, Gene Sharp's definition of nonviolent action depends only on observable behavior. He showed no interest in that definition in what people intended, even though for Gandhi, intention was central. So these, I think, pose great problems for the use of the word nonviolence today, in the sense that Gandhi meant, if we're trying to communicate with 21st century speakers, and even with people who are well-versed in peace studies. Another point about this is that I think there's a larger trend that's described in the paper that I call a grand political turn in moral accountability. And I'll get into this a little with some of the graphs, but the basic idea is that through the process of secularization, which I think that at least neo-secularization or the versions of that are more sophisticated, that come out of the sociology of religion, kind of established that there's been a shift in moral authority toward social and political accountability and away from religious authority. And that has consequences also for how we think about nonviolence in the way that Gandhi meant. The second overview slide has to do with some of the roots of this in those choices that I mentioned that Gandhi made. So the word ahimsa derives from the Sanskrit word himsa, and Gandhi translated them most commonly as non-violence for ahimsa and violence for himsa. If you look in Sanskrit dictionaries and in Gandhi's own writing, these words are translated in other ways as well, but this is the main way that they're usually translated, and that the main translations that he himself used. Gandhi saw ahimsa as a positive concept, not merely the absence of violence, but the presence of a kind of universal love and benevolence and goodwill, a force for good in the world. He also saw it as a desiderative, expressing intention first and foremost, not just observable action, but what we have in our minds and hearts. And also as an unachievable ideal. He wrote that perfect nonviolence is impossible. So he saw it in these ways, and that, I want to say also, is not really conveyed in a lot of contemporary understandings or uses of nonviolence, the term. Michael Nagler, who's somebody I've learned a great deal from, I consider myself a student. In a way, I've met him and done his online courses and read his books. He's called the translation of ahimsa as nonviolence misleading for these reasons. And he wrote in a book called The Future, forgetting the exact name of the book, but he wrote about how this is one of the main problems that he'd like to solve. The paper that I've written proposes alternative translations based on my understanding of English first and foremost, and then having read what the various Sanskrit interpretations of these words are, what I'm proposing is that we translate ahimsa as beneficence and himsa as maleficence. So this captures both the intentionality as a central element of these concepts and the fact that they refer to action also, as opposed to benevolence and malice, which are kind of purely intentional. These words are meant to convey that we're talking about those intentions put into practice. The paper goes into a lot more detail about how these words are chosen. The third overview slide is about the practical, at least a practical upshot of this. Why would I care about this and what might it do for us? So I encountered Gandhi mostly as an activist. I'd heard of Gandhi before I did nonviolence training, but I think a lot of us who are activists first learn about Gandhi and nonviolence through nonviolence training. And what I found after going back and reading Gandhi, what the picture I had been given or gotten of Gandhi was quite distorted in relation to what Gandhi actually thought and wrote. And in particular, at least in North America, I think nonviolence training tends to focus on techniques of resistance and other behaviors that is designed to achieve practical goals. And in particular, although that's very useful, and even I found personally transformative each time I went through it, for me, it fails to emphasize what Gandhi considered the most important for aligning oneself with ahimsa, which is changing how one thinks about oneself and about other people, changing how one thinks. Intentions, the primacy of the mental. Just in my experience, is not particularly emphasized in nonviolence training. So I want to ask, what would it look like if we did instead something called beneficence training, which would really emphasize, because by definition, have to emphasize our intentions. So this is just not just an academic exercise. I really would like to relate this to real world practice. All right, how many are doing at time? Okay, so but the rest of the talk, I'm going to go through some highlights from the paper, some graphs, which illustrate some of the points that are made in it and the argument. So this is a lot of the graphs in the paper are from Google Ngram. They show the relative prevalence of words and phrases since 1800. And here is one in which you can see the recent growth in use in published books in English of the word violence. So you can see since the 1940s, it's really taken off. And actually, there was a period in the 19th century when it was also almost as high. Curiously, during Gandhi's own time, and during the periods of the world wars, the most violent period in world history, violence was in a trough. So it's kind of a strange thing here. Another interesting thing is that one of the figures who really got Engram going was Steven Pinker, who of course wrote the book Better Angels of Our Nature about the decline of violence. He didn't actually do this analysis. So I don't know if he knows that the word violence has gone up so much. He certainly has argued that violence itself has gone down in that same period. So he may or may not be right about that, but the use of violence itself as a word has dramatically increased. So the paper goes into reasons why this might be the case, but I think one reason might be, as I'll get into, this expansion of the scope of the meaning of violence. This is something I did the last time I presented at PJSA in Nelson in 2016. I don't know if any of you were there. I asked attendees, for each of these 4 sentences, does this sentence make sense or is it odd? Is it something that you could say or would say? And these were the responses. So the number on the left is those who thought it made sense, and the number on the right is those who thought it was odd. The protest was somewhat violent. So most thought that made sense. A few thought it was odd. The protest was somewhat nonviolent. No one in that group thought that that made sense. They all thought it was odd. And then the other two have to do with the words just and unjust, kind of more or less even split in saying it's odd or not. For the verdict was somewhat unjust, or the verdict was somewhat just. So, and that mirrors what I see when I look at Engram. So here's an Engram plot for just and unjust, the main thing to see here is that there are occurrences steadily throughout history for both the concept of somewhat unjust and somewhat just. And I've done this for variants like a little bit, partially, etc. They're all in the paper. What this shows is that these are linguistically graded antonyms. You can have degrees of justice for that concept. But as the user or the PJSA attendee data show, nonviolence does not function that way. The Engram plot shows that violent and nonviolent are ungraded antonyms. There were zero occurrences throughout history of the phrase somewhat nonviolent. You can do this check this for yourself if you go to Engram. So I'm making a case here that nonviolent and violent have this ungraded character, and that gets in the way of saying that something is nonviolent. Because if there's any violence there, as Nagler himself has argued, then it's hard to say that what's present is nonviolent. So we're putting ourselves at a disadvantage, in other words, with the way the language works. When we say we're going to be nonviolent, if something happens that doesn't fit that. Here's an Engram showing changes in the uses of nonviolence and other words. So you can see that in the period since the 60s, with a little trough there in the early 80s, nonviolence has increased in its usage, and it's now more popular than civil disobedience, pacifism, and civil resistance, from humble beginnings in the early 20th century. It's also gone down a bit in the last 20 years or so, but not that much. So what this shows is it's actually a pretty popular concept relative to these other terms. So what we do with this word matters, and right now it's popular, but I think problematic for the reasons that I've stated. One of the reasons I said has to do with the scope of the word violence. And here you can see a plot of different phrases that use modifiers for violence, including structural violence, Galton's term, which has really taken off since the 60s. We also have psychological violence, cultural violence, systemic, emotional, economic violence. In the last year, I've read about semiotic violence. So all of these are very useful phrases which describe important forms of harm and injury, and it really raised people's consciousness. But again, I think we should think about this in relation to what effect that has on our concept of nonviolence. So where does that increase in violence, the word violence, come from? This slide, I'm arguing, is an indication, one of several indications, along with the last slide, that it has to do with this expanded scope. Because the word violence itself has really increased a lot. The word violent, the adjective, has not increased nearly as much. So this is, and that's, I think, because these modifiers tend not to be used for that one. They tend to be used for the noun. Here's an Engram. So shifting a little bit in the paper, here's an Engram analysis for the two words violence and sin. What you can see is that in the 19th century, sin was in, right? And now violence the word violence is much more prevalent than sin. Gandhi often used the word sin. He liked it a lot. It's one of the things that some of his contemporary followers don't really go along with that much. But I think what this reveals is that political neo-secular turn that I was talking about, right? We can see it here with the decline of this concept of sin, which is a kind of personal and internal concept between you and your God in many cases, and violence, which is an external observable thing. Right, I'm going to skip that one. I only have a couple of minutes. And we'll skip that one too. This one shows usage of beneficent and nonviolent. So what this also shows, I think, the mirror of the political turn. The word beneficent was really big in the 19th century. It's declined a lot. Word nonviolent, of course, has gone way up. They have crossed. And so I'm arguing for a revival, in a sense, of this concept of beneficence and a recovery of the original meaning of Ahimsa. So similarly with maleficence and other words like that, all of these mental related, intention related, spiritual and religious terms from the 19th century have declined dramatically. And I'm not saying we should bring back the 19th century or the kinds of religious authority that existed then. But I think we should pause and think about what this means and what it might reflect about our contemporary world. So I'll end with this quote. This is a famous quote in one sense. It's from Gandhi in 1913. He says, "We but mirror the world. All the tendencies present in the outer world are to be found in the world of our body. If we could change ourselves, the tendencies in the world would also change. As a man changes, of course, a woman, their own nature, so does the attitude of the world change toward them. This is the divine mystery supreme." So this is, I think, the source for the what's often misquoted as "be the change that you want to see in the world." This is what he really said. And so I think this really underlies his philosophy that changing ourselves, our attitudes, our intentions is the key to social change. And that's just not the message that we get from nonviolence training. So I'll end there. And I guess we'll have questions afterward, or unless there's any quick reactions, corrections. All right, so I'm gonna yeah, let's see here. Unshare be the first step. And then I'm gonna put my computer over here. Oh, you're gonna, okay.
Yeah.
Do that.
Bear with us while we set up for the next technology.
I have to change my background.
It's good that we have tech assistance. Yeah.
I need to turn my.
Let me make it full screen. Oh, great. Okay, hello, everybody. Can is it ready?
Yep, it looks good.
I have to keep track of the time here. Hello, what? Ready?
I'll keep track of time. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, okay. This is weird, though. Oh, I see what it's doing. Okay. What? What? Is that better? It's not showing the full screen here. Okay. All right. Hello, everybody. I'm Linda Groff, and my presentation is on influences on Gandhi's concepts of peace and nonviolence, and then some characteristics of and stages of his nonviolence, and then a number of other people that follow in Gandhi's tradition in terms of their own use of nonviolence. So, and I agree with what Todd presented, that, you know, Gandhi focused on the internal intentions, which a lot of the people that follow in Gandhi's tradition, I think we could say, have those same intentions.
You're not sharing on the
What?
share screen on the.
It's not sure, what?
I got it.
You'll fix it.
Just a minute.
That's my fault. All right.
Allow Zoom to share.
What?
Oh, that's the room. Would any of you like to speak while we focus on the room?
Oh wait, it is working because we're okay.
But then how do we go? Yeah, go back to this.
There we go.
Weird.
This is going to be full screen. Oh,
Can-
good.
Are we seeing it on Zoom? Are we seeing it?
Is this recording now on Zoom?
No.
Oh, maybe you could.
It is.
Oh, it is.
Well, it's recording, but
Well,
it's
it's
not,
recorded, but you
it's
don't
not
see the
sharing.
slide.
There's no PowerPoint presentation.
Now that
On
you
Zoom.
change the preferences, just click the
Wait,
PowerPoint.
wait, there was a
Yeah, it
PowerPoint.
was set up.
Okay.
Huh?
It showed up below desktop.
Oh, right, that's the full screen.
It should go now.
There it is.
Is it working?
Oh,
Is that,
looks
is that
right to me.
recording?
Yeah.
Yay.
Okay. Sorry. Yeah, the preferences.
Huh?
ahead.
Okay, so, okay, can I start my time now?
Yeah.
All right.
We got some flex time.
Okay. So my presentation has the following sections. I'm going to do first some definitions of peace and nonviolence that I use in my own book, Peace Book, forthcoming. Then I'm going to look at Gandhi's concepts of nonviolence and influences on Gandhi's view of nonviolence, then some stages and characteristics of Gandhi's nonviolence. And we can have a good discussion after. So, and then also a number of people influenced by Gandhi and who I would say are in the tradition of Gandhi's nonviolence, which I believe is also internal and spiritually based. All these people come from different spiritual traditions, but they do have a spiritual part to their nonviolence as a philosophy of life, as opposed to just a temporary, strategy. These are a few quotes on nonviolence from Gandhi. You probably know all these, maybe all of you. Violence breeds violence. Pure goals can never justify impure or violent actions. They say the means are, after all, just means, and basically saying the means are just as important as the ends. And also that an eye for an eye makes the whole world blind. Those are all popular quotes. If you want to change the world, change yourself, and so on. Okay, these are definitions I use in my own forthcoming book on peace, which is peace are visions and goals for society and the world that if we were able to implement them would help to create cultures of peace on planet Earth. And nonviolence is both a goal, but it's also the desired means to bring about those different goals. It is very interesting, the discussion today about what is violent or what is, that is there anybody who's purely nonviolent? If you start looking at violence as not just actions, but intentions, and there's so many levels that one can look at. But nonviolence is a funny word even itself, because it's non-something, as opposed to something positive. Okay, that's the cover of my forthcoming book with the cosmos. You might wonder why that's on a peace book, but I'm a big picture person and I like pictures of the cosmos, so there it is. Okay, part two. There's always been individuals who have practiced nonviolence, and you all know these examples: Henry David Thoreau, Leo Tolstoy in Russia, and Peace Pilgrim. But Gandhi is so famous because he's the first person who collectively created movements for using nonviolence for needed change. And he started, everybody knows these stories. He started in South Africa when he was discriminated against for the color of his skin. And then when he went back to India and led the whole movement for independence of India from the British Empire. But all later practitioners of nonviolence, I think in the Gandhi tradition, go back to him, obviously. But these are some different influences on Gandhi. The Bhagavad Gita is important Hindu scripture that was very important to him. But what I learned is very interesting is that Gandhi, I met both Ella Gandhi and Arun Gandhi at different times. And they're both grandson and granddaughter of Mahatma Gandhi. And they all affirmed that when they were growing up and then when their parents grew up under Gandhi, that they grew up not just reading scriptures from the Bhagavad Gita, but they read scriptures from many religions. So they really came from a spiritual point of view, but one open to different traditions, which is important, I think. And then also the Jain religion had a big impact on Gandhi because when he was growing up, his mother, they had people from Jain religion visiting their home a lot. And the Jain religion also, very much believes in nonviolence as a way of life. And then Leo Tolstoy is another person. Well, let me just go through each one. So Gandhi, this is the part about Gandhi's, at the end he said, I am a Christian, a Muslim, a Buddhist, and a Jew. So he rejected the Hindu caste system. And then the influence of the Jain religion was because he grew up with that in his family, and his mother was very also impacted by the Jain religion. And there was a particular Jain monk, Srimad Rajchandra, that had a big impact on Gandhi. Then Leo Tolstoy and Gandhi had a long correspondence with each other. And they found a common commitment to the principles of nonviolence and love. And Tolstoy said, love is the only way to rescue humanity from its sins, or ills, not sins, ills. And then there was Tolstoy's book, The Kingdom of God is Within You, as well as an article he did on Christianity and patriotism had a big impact on Gandhi. But they stressed simplicity of life and purity of purpose from Tolstoy. And then an English economist also, by the way, I read that Madame Blavatsky, that Gandhi met her, I think, in London when he was studying to be a barrister. And she's another person who, I still have to do a little more reading on that, but she was a Russian who was very much into different mystical traditions around the world. But apparently Gandhi was influenced also and had some connection with her. And then in terms of English economists, John Ruskin believed that he had a book called Unto This Last. And there were three aspects that he believed in. The good of an individual is embedded in the good of all. Any type of work is equally dignified if based on ethical living, and manual work is also just as important and worthwhile. And apparently Gandhi knew the first principle, but got the second and third principles from Ruskin and then incorporated that. And of course, later he wore a loincloth and worked at a spinning wheel and so on. So these words, this gets into your presentation a little bit, but satyagraha from two Sanskrit words, satya meaning truth forced and agraha meaning insistence on or holding firmly to. And so Gandhi said that sometimes this is interpreted as passive resistance, but the focus really, this is from the Metta Center too, that Michael Nagler, that the focus needs to also be on the internal development, the internal intention that you were talking about. Okay, and that it's a moral force also, a soul force. And then the other word is ahimsa, which you focused on, harmlessness, that one's life in the world, that your internal state relates to your state in the world, in your situation in the world. And that this also is a concept that comes from Hinduism, Buddhism, and Jainism. Okay, stages in Gandhi's use of nonviolence. This is just a quick little summary. Wait. So he believed you had to exhaust every opportunity in each stage before you go on to the next stage, that you shouldn't skip stages, And that each stage, if you are successful in achieving your original goals, then you don't have to go on to the next stage. But if you don't achieve what you wanted, then you go on to the next stage eventually. And then you finally end up with a counter-government in exile if the existing government won't grant you anything that you're asking for. But this is quick stages. First, utilization of all the regular constitutional machinery existing in the system. And if you have a democracy, there are probably more opportunities for protest and change than if you don't. The second stage is agitation, educating the people about the issues involved. The third stage is ultimatum stage, where you present demands to the government that you think are just demands, and then the government can accept them or not. A fourth stage is self-purification, where you prepare for direct action if that's necessary, and making sure your motives are pure and so on. And then the fifth stage is a number of different forms of direct action, protest, boycott, strikes, civil disobedience, etc. And then in that, you just want to disobey the unjust laws, not all laws. And then the sixth stage is, if everything else fails, you finally set up a counter government in exile because the existing government has failed to respond to any of your demands or any of your just requests and lost legitimacy. So these are quick characteristics of Gandhi's nonviolence. The means are as important as the ends. And however noble the ends, if you use violence, that will sort of pervert the goals that you're trying to achieve. One only opposes unjust laws, not all laws. Your strength doesn't come because you have superior military force at all, but obviously because you have a moral just issue on your side that you can appeal to support from your opponent as well as world public opinion, because you have a just issue. And you have to exhaust all the possibilities of each stage. These are important. Try to keep the nonviolence on a human level, the struggle, so that you're appealing to the moral, your moral issue is what gives you added strength. And this part about don't dehumanize your opponent, because you have to use violence, you have to dehumanize your opponent. And that's the problem with it, because then you make that, you get negative words to characterize them. I mean, Donald Trump is a perfect example of doing that every day, just trying to character destroy other people, and the opposite of what this would be. And so the interesting question to me also is, in nonviolence, you're appealing to the moral conscience of your opponent and world public opinion. But would that work with someone like Trump? I mean, you would hope, but he has no shame. And I'm not sure he has very strong internalized values of justice, except, so it's a very interesting question, how to, that's a different issue. I'm working on something on. Okay, so these are all the people that I've looked at that follow in the tradition of Gandhi. So I'll go through each one, but first of all, there's like at least two main traditions of nonviolence. One is Gandhi's purposive, or what I also add, spiritually based nonviolence, because that helped give internal strength to him to do what he was doing. And all these other people that follow, and what I say is the Gandhian tradition, also have that characteristic. They can be from any faith tradition, but they have some kind of internalized faith that has been part of their movement. And then Gene Sharp's strategic nonviolence. I talked to him at a past conference. He passed away, what was it, 2 years ago? Yeah, but he used to speak at conferences of PJSA too, and I asked him about that, and he said he didn't want people to feel that to use nonviolence they had to be spiritually based, because that would maybe limit it, and also that it could be in his view, you could use nonviolence as a temporary strategy, not a permanent philosophy of life, which was more Gandhi's tradition. But I think there's a gray area between them and overlap. Like someone could start like in Gene Sharp's tradition and then maybe move into the other one. And so it's not totally polarized type of thing, which is also quite important, I think. So anyway, the next people I'm looking at are all the people that followed in Gandhi's nonviolence tradition. And they're sometimes called the Gandhi of this country or that country and so on. And a number of them got Nobel Peace Prizes or other peace awards. So Badshah Khan, people don't always remember him, I don't think, but he was in India at the time of Gandhi. They were good friends. he was opposed to British rule and so on. He was a devout Muslim of Pashtun origin, and he's known as the Frontier Gandhi. And after the partition of India, which really broke, I think, Gandhi's heart, but also it was also, Badshah Khan was opposed to that. And then he ended up in Pakistan after that, and he tried to get, he started, well, this is interesting. He did start a Servants of God movement, which was the world's first nonviolent army. And I don't know if there are other examples of that, but it's an interesting concept. Under partition, the Pashtuns became part of Pakistan. He sought autonomy for them, but Pakistan didn't agree. He spent time in jail and exile. And then when he died, he had his remains sent to Afghanistan, but he remains a Pashtun national hero. Okay, the next person everybody knows, Dr. Martin Luther King, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, a Christian Baptist minister in the US who was critical in the whole US civil rights struggle and the use of nonviolence, a great orator. I found a lot of great quotes also from Martin Luther King. He used a number of different things, bus boycotts, nonviolent protests, sit-ins, the Selma to Montgomery March. And he gave, he had a famous speech, I Have a Dream, and a letter from a Birmingham jail is also quite famous. And he was very involved with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And later in his life, he got more controversial because he started talking about poverty and opposing the Vietnam War. And he ended up, he also had a Nobel Peace Prize for fighting for racial equality. And there are a couple other people I noted here in the tradition of Martin Luther King, really, but Martin Luther King's in the tradition of Gandhi, which is that, well, he was assassinated in 1968. I'm sorry, I'm still here. Oh, this is the thing. Right the night before Martin Luther King was assassinated, he gave this famous "I've been to the mountaintop" speech. And I always found that so amazing because he obviously knew he was going to be assassinated. And he said, "I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land." And the next day he was assassinated. And then, so to me, that was pretty amazing. These are other people in the US civil rights tradition that influenced Gandhi, the first two. And the third one is someone you've all know, John Lewis. So I'll go through each one. Bayard Russell was a gay Quaker nonviolent strategist who fought for civil rights and gay rights. And he helped Martin Luther King organize the March on Washington in 1963. And then James Lawson is somebody I've met different times in LA. He lives in Los Angeles, where I'm from. And he was a big advocate of Gandhi's philosophy and practice of nonviolence and a mentor and strategist to Martin Luther King and other civil rights leaders. And he was involved in the civil rights struggles to desegregate downtown Nashville, involved with SNCC, and a Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, involved with Freedom Rides, and involved with Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And he invited, in 1968, invited King to Memphis to support a sanitation workers strike. And that's where King gave his famous "I've been to the mountaintop" speech. And the next day he was assassinated, which I think really also kind of broke Reverend Lawson's heart because he was very committed to all these issues. But he continues to teach workshops in LA all the time, but also, he's a bit older now, but also all over the country and the world. And he's a really lovely person. And he's spoken at PJSA before. And then John Lewis was a fearless advocate, especially voting rights. And, he's famous for, he passed away in 2020, but he was co-founder and chair of SNCC. And then he broke on the issue of violence, nonviolence with Stokely Carmichael. And then, 2 minutes, oh God, okay. All right, I'm gonna have to hurry here, but he was eventually elected to Congress, and he became the conscience of the Congress, and spoke about, I like this, making good trouble was his phrase. Yeah, Cesar Chavez was head of the attempt to organize the farm workers that created the United Farm Workers, and participated in many different things and nominated 3 times for Nobel Peace Prize by Martin Luther King. Bishop Desmond Tutu in South Africa. Can I get 2 more minutes just to kind of quickly do this? Desmond Tutu, you all know about, fought against apartheid in South Africa and was also the head of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission after the end of apartheid. And there's different views about that Reconciliation Commission. But anyway, he worked to eliminate poverty, racism, homophobia, et cetera, and used the term Rainbow Nation, and also was a Nobel Peace Prize winner. And then there's a number also of Buddhists, I'll have to go through them quickly, who also follow in the tradition of Gandhi. And they're all Buddhist as their faith tradition. So the Dalai Lama in Tibet had to flee Tibet because the Chinese invaded and go to Dharamsala in northern India. And so Chinese-Tibetan relations are still a big problem for Tibet because the Chinese have moved in a lot of Chinese into Tibet, and the Tibetans are now a minority in their own country. And I think over 6,000 monasteries in Tibet have been destroyed and so on. So, you know, the Dalai Lama doesn't ask for total independence. He's asked for autonomy within China, but the Chinese haven't been very receptive to that. And okay, so this is another person that I have met at conferences before. That was the prime minister of the Tibetan government in exile, and another lovely person who had to flee Tibet, and very committed to nonviolence. So Venerable Professor Samdang Rinpoche. I'm going to have to do this quickly. All right. But anyway, the Dalai Lama has given up in 2011. I think his political role as head of the government, but he's still the spiritual leader. And now they've created a younger person elected as the political head. But the problem of Tibet is still, there's a question, there's a Dalai Lama and a Panchen Lama. And the problem is that each one, when the other one dies, they have to find a child that is a reincarnation of the previous Panchen Lama or Dalai Lama. And they have to do it because the child recognizes certain artifacts and things from the previous person. And so the Dalai Lama actually named a new Panchen Lama when the old one died. But then the Chinese went and said, kidnap the family, and they've never been heard from again, and the child. And then the Chinese, which is really bizarre, named their own Panchen Lama. And so when the Dalai Lama dies, it's not clear, you know, who would recognize the new Dalai Lama. So that's an ongoing issue. Okay, well, I'm gonna keep going here. Thich Nhat Hanh is very important. He's another Buddhist monk, a Zen Buddhist monk from Vietnam, and later he created a community in France, Plum Village, and he's the originator of socially engaged Buddhism, which is very important because it took the idea of inner meditation of Buddhists with the idea of responsibility for the suffering in the world. And so he saw suffering in Vietnam, and in his own monastery, they had a question about what to do. Did they just still meditate, or do they go out in the community? And they decided to do both, which is the origin of socially engaged Buddhism. And okay, so Thich Nhat Hanh also started this order of interbeing. In his view, everything is interdependent in the whole entire universe. And so he started, so that means if you're a monk in a monastery too, you can't be separate from the world because everything's interdependent. So let's see, so his idea of interbeing is quite a well-known concept. And I won't go through this. He talks about a piece of paper, how it's interdependent with everything else. Yeah. But he I think wrote over 100 books. He was at Princeton and Columbia and so on. But the bottom line is that Peace is Every Step and Being Peace are 2 famous books of his. He was nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize by Martin Luther King and so on. But he had a massive stroke in 2014. And then in 2018, he went back to his original monastery in Vietnam. And he can't speak or anything anymore. So, you know, he's went back there to basically spend his last days. Maha Ghosananda is now deceased, but he was a monk from Cambodia who tried to do healing during from the Khmer Rouge period in his own country and led different, tried to clear landmines and so on. And he also was nominated for Nobel Peace Prize 4 times. It's called the Gandhi of Cambodia. Sulak Sivarak is not a monk, but he's a Buddhist and from Thailand, and he's written 100 books too, and led all kinds of movements in Thailand and concerned with poverty and environmental economic issues. And he received the Alternative Nobel Prize, Right Livelihood Award. And then Atre Rodney from Sri Lanka is another socially engaged Buddhist from Sri Lanka, founder of the Sarvodaya Shramadana movement anyway, and he does projects in 15,000 villages and tried to deal with the, again, the effects and healing after civil war in his country between the Sri Lankan government and the Tamil Tigers. And so he's called the Gandhi of Sri Lanka. I've got to end up and nominated for Peace Prize. And then the last person I have here is Swami Agnivesh from India. He's I've met him at conferences too. He decided to give up a career in law and so on, and ended up starting this movement, Arya Samaj. But he's done all kinds of things against bonded labor, of intergenerational slavery of a child from the parents, and then fought for women's rights. And he's also many other issues. He's against the sati idea that this is a horrible tradition in India where the wife would be burned on the funeral pyre with her husband when he died. So he's fought against that and female infanticide and so on, and worked for Aboriginal Indians and so on, and been very involved with interfaith. And he calls him what he does social spirituality instead of engaged Buddhism. So I'm gonna, and this is the last one. Aung San Suu Kyi, is another Buddhist, but has had a fall from grace. I mean, she, this is a sort of sad story. She's the only woman in the group I have here too, unfortunately. But she was under house arrest for years. Her father led independence for Myanmar, formerly Burma. But then they had, and the military was in control, and then she ran for office when they allowed to have elections. Became a leader of the country, then they had re-elections. But anyway, she remained silent about the Rohingya Muslim minority. And so she's lost her credibility with a lot of people as a human rights activist. So those are all the people I went over. And the bottom conclusion, I think there's different traditions of nonviolence, Gene Sharp as well as Gandhi's tradition. They're both important and they overlap. And so I focused on the Gandhi tradition and as part of a philosophy of life. And so I would just conclude that wherever possible, nonviolence is preferable to violence, because violence leads to more violence and you have to dehumanize your opponent. And so even though nonviolence may be harder, it's a superior form of struggle. So I'm going to end with that, and I'm sorry it took too long. Okay. Yeah.
So we're just going to set up, bear with us while we set up for our next speaker, and there'll be time for questions at the end.
Okay, so I'll continue on then. All right. So, who was Aurobindo Ghosh? Well, in the first decade of the 20th century, he was a revolutionary nationalist in Bengal, and he was deeply involved with what was called the Swadeshi movement, which was, it was somewhat similar to Gandhi's later movement, but it was boycotting British goods and supporting indigenous goods, and it involved other forms of protest as well. It was a very turbulent time in Bengal's modern history. But unlike Gandhi, we solved one problem. Okay, unlike Gandhi, and in 1907, 1908, he was really at the forefront of the agitation for independence. He was the key national figure. But unlike Gandhi, he was in support of the use of violence. And he used passive resistance by getting over to Linda's talk. It was a strategic use of nonviolence. And he thought that at a certain point, you have to escalate it and turn it into active resistance, into violence. And in particular, when the enemy strikes you, you have to defend yourself, and you have every right to use violence to defend yourself. And furthermore, he considered, the use of passive resistance is like strategic maneuverings on a battlefield. You don't necessarily strike yet, but you move your troops around, and that's what passive resistance can be all about. You do before the battle begins. So that was his approach to passive resistance. And before Gandhi was writing much about passive resistance, he had a lengthy set of essays on passive resistance, articulating the philosophy of it. And not surprisingly,
Excuse me.
1908,
Excuse me,
okay.
oh yeah, we can't hear you. I can't hear you at all. There's audibility, but no ability to hear really what you're saying. Yesterday, someone used a common microphone, but I don't know if that will help. But we don't want to miss your words, Ted.
Okay.
Where it's coming from, as long as I can hear it.
So why don't you, yeah, then we're gonna get,
Now I can't even find my PowerPoint.
Technology is wonderful.
Exactly. I do need to be able to.
hello? So it looks like the,
I did, I muted.
Is it everyone turns off their, not the microphone, but the actual sound.
well, the problem is that the audio for Zoom is coming through the speakers up there.
If you just turn off your sound.
Turn up the audio,
Okay, phone. Okay.
mute my sound.
Yeah, you did that. Okay,
Can you hear me now?
you should be able to. I unmuted you. Okay, okay, let's go. I think we're good. So anyways, my PowerPoint froze in the middle of all this, so I need to reopen my PowerPoint. He's already sharing. You just need to, you just need to put in presenter mode. Okay, we'll try round 4 now. Thanks for your patience. All right,
here we go again.
So not surprisingly, given this approach of his, on May 2nd, 1908, he was arrested in conjunction with a bombing. To what degree Aurobindo was involved with his bombing is not clear, but his brother was definitely involved. So anyways, moving forward here, when he was released from prison a year later, he was acquitted. When he was released from prison a year later, he tried to continue his prior leadership. However, the Swadeshi movement at this point was pretty much dead. Politically, in terms of a movement towards independence, the country was just simply dead at that time. So after a year of effort, he moved to Pondicherry in South India, which was under French control, not British control. And then over the coming years and decades, he acquired quite a reputation as a philosopher and a spiritual master, a poet and a mystic, and so on. And he's got quite a worldwide reputation over time as a spiritual master. And briefly speaking, in terms of his spiritual philosophy, one of the things that he did was take classic ideas of Hindu spirituality and combine them with today's ideas of biological evolution to give a modern synthesis of classic Hindu philosophy. So that's a brief rundown on the man, Aurobindo Ghosh. But back to the topic of the paper, his critiques of Gandhi's early mass mobilization. And I'm going to talk about 4 different periods here, 5 different statements. The very first time that Gandhi and his movement appears in Aurobindo's writing, Aurobindo expresses shock and derision. Later, he becomes quite admiring, hope and admiration, then even greater hope and admiration. But then in 1916, and this is during his spiritual phase, so I'll put this in a different color. Then during his spiritual phase, he expresses a serious reservation. And then in 1924, there is a summary statement that I can give you, and we'll see how far we make it through all of this. So anyways, to begin with, shock and derision. The context here. And my PowerPoint is frozen again, which it does from time to time. Okay. So Gandhi is in South Africa, and as some of you, probably all of you are aware, he supported the British in the South African War, and he supported the British in the Zulu Rebellion. And, you know, people stress that, oh, he played in a medical capacity. He organized this ambulance corps that was healing, that wasn't, you know, that wasn't injurious. However, he makes it very clear in his writings that his intent was to support the British. At this point in his life, he feels that the British Empire is a good thing and it needs to be petitioned. You know, there are problems, but ultimately he believed that British rule was good. And he believed that it was his duty, especially if he wanted rights as a citizen under the British Empire, if he and other Indians wanted rights, that he had to stand by them on the battlefield in wartime. And so he supported the British through the Ambulance Corps in the South African War and the Zulu Rebellion. And Aurobindo thought that was just crazy, absolutely crazy. And this is the first time that Gandhi appears in any of his writings, not by name, but he says, after their splendid services in the Transvaal War or the South African War had been rewarded by the grossest ingratitude, they had no business to offer their services again in the recent Natal Rebellion, the Zulu Rebellion. By their act, they associated themselves with the colonists in their oppression of the natives of the country and have only themselves to thank if they are oppressed by the same narrow and arrogant colonial spirit. And so part of the context here, if I told you Gandhi's context, Aurobindo's context, is that he is busy fighting, you could say, this internal war with other Indians on the Indian National Congress. There were the moderates of the Indian National Congress who didn't want to remove British rule. They simply wanted to expand the Indian role in British government, in British rule. And Aurobindo and the extremists thought that that's crazy. The British are here as parasites only. There's going to be no possible cooperation with them. We have to get rid of them. And so him criticizing Gandhi was a part of him fighting that battle between the moderates and extremists on the Indian National Congress, saying any sort of cooperation with the British is just out of the question. We have to sever ties. So if Gandhi appears for the first time in Aurobindo's writings in this critical light, in 1908, he is really quite excited and pleased by Gandhi's activities, although he still doesn't mention Gandhi by name. And what's happening here is, at this point, Gandhi himself has realized that, politely petitioning British authorities is not going to get anywhere, that something more is going to be needed. And so he was protesting the Asiatic Act, which required Indians in the Transvaal to register with the government and to submit fingerprints and so on. And so he initiated passive resistance for the first time, mass passive resistance for the first time in conjunction with the Asiatic Act. And this is exactly what Aurobindo thought was needed. You've got to fight these guys. You have to resist them. And moreover, it seemed in early 1908 that Gandhi had an initial success. The agreement with Smuts was that if the Indians voluntarily register, that the requirement to register would be dropped. Gandhi considered that a victory. And so Aurobindo in India was picking up on that and saying, look at what these Indians in South Africa did. And this is what we in India need to do. Suddenly Gandhi's movement became an example. The struggle in the Transvaal was carried on with unity, perseverance, and thoroughness to a success less absolutely unconditional, but even more striking from the strength and stubbornness the enemy it had to overcome. And then back to India, the might of 300 millions welded into a single force will be a potency so gigantic that the imagination fails to put a limit to the final results of the movement now in its infancy. So if this is what Indians, a small minority in South Africa, could accomplish, think of what all of us together in India could accomplish through passive resistance, not excluding violence, but he's talking here about passive resistance as an example. And then Aurobindo's context is 1908. If the Swadeshi, in 1908, the Swadeshi movement in Bengal was flagging, it was starting to fall. And if we have time for question and answer, we can talk later about why it was flagging. But then 1909, even more praise and admiration for Gandhi. And Gandhi's context is that, the agreement that he believed he had with the government of the Transvaal did not work out. So now he has renewed passive resistance. And, as you may know, he continued over the next 7 years or so, passive resistance movements in South Africa. And so what happens here is that in Aurobindo's new periodical, after he's out of jail, and when the Swadeshi movement in Bengal is just simply dead, and there's no life, no vitality, no more enthusiasm for independence or Swadeshi, Aurobindo is again saying, look at what these Indians in South Africa did against all odds. and look at that faith that they had in the spirit, in terms of practicality, in terms of reason, it would seem that their movement would fail, but they had faith in the spirit. They had faith that they were on the side of truth. And because they're on the side because their faith that they're on the side of truth, they're moving forward against all odds. And look at us in India, we're not doing that. So again, 1909, Gandhi and his movement is a great example for our Aurobindo, and he's trying to hold that out to other Indians. So if that's 1908 to 1909, and I'm probably moving through this a little bit faster than I intended to, trying to leave at least some time for questions here, but I think all my points are pretty clear. So 1916, 1916, he's left the political movement behind 6 years, even though the British still considered him public enemy #1. He's left politics behind. He's spending his time in Pondicherry, meditating and writing poetry. He is very, very poor at this time because he's spending all his time meditating. Some disciples have gathered around him. The beginnings of an ashram or a monastery are in place. He's got some income going on through his writings and publications, and so serious reservations. So if he's deep into Indian spirituality at this point, well, we have this image up here of Lord Shiva, and Shiva, he is God the destroyer. There is the great Trimurti of Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva, creator, preserver, and destroyer. And in classical Hinduism, there's the idea that God creates, that God preserves, and that God destroys. And moreover, the Bhagavad Gita, that small portion of the great epic, the Mahabharata, the Bhagavad Gita having been so important to Gandhi, as Linda brought out. Well, what is the Gita? The Gita is set in this great epic of war, the Mahabharata. And when you read a portion of the Gita and portions of the Mahabharata, you learn that this war is God's will. Right now I'm reading, I think, book 13 of the Mahabharata, the Night Massacre. And, when the armies are destroyed after this terrible night massacre, they're saying this was fate, this was God's will. And it's Lord Shiva who destroyed the armies in that book 13, those armies as they slept. So what is Aurobindo saying here, and what is his point? Well, the battlefield of Kurukshetra, Gandhi had his interpretation of Kurukshetra, what that battlefield was, but this is Aurobindo Ghosh's interpretation of the battlefield of Kurukshetra. His interpretation is the outward aspect of Kurukshetra is that of world existence and human existence proceeding by struggle and slaughter. The inward aspect is that of the universal being fulfilling himself in a vast creation and a vast destruction. Life is a battle and a field of death. This is Kurukshetra, the God, the terrible. So according to him, death and destruction is just simply a part of life. It's inherent to existence. That's the way the divine works. And that fits in with this whole system of involution and evolution that I talked to you about earlier. So he's blending, evolutionary biology with classic Hindu ideas. So in his essays on the Gita, he makes 3 specific critiques of Gandhi's Satyagraha. Now, this is 1916. Gandhi is not yet a big figure in India, but Aurobindo seems to be very much aware of Gandhi and his ideas. He doesn't mention Gandhi by name, but he does use the term soul force. He does refer to soul force here. And so before I show you these critiques, his key point is that you're never going to escape from violence. You can't avoid it. That's the key point that he wants to make here. You might think that you can, but you can't. So critique number 1, the demonic force in men and nations tramples down, breaks, slaughters, burns, pollutes, as we see it doing today, but then at its ease and unhindered, and you have perhaps caused as much destruction of life by your abstinence as others by resort to violence. So in short, in brief, if you don't have a police force, if you don't have an army, then you open yourself up to attack from others. You have to use violence sometimes in order to put down violence. If you don't have law and order and so on, and if you don't have people to enforce that, there's going to be violence. So a little bit ironic here that, earlier he was complaining about the British authorities, but in Essays on the Gita, at least in this part, he sounds a little bit a law and order man. And then the next point here, he believes in soul force. He believes that a soul force is a very, very powerful spiritual force. And, he understands the spiritual power of what Gandhi is doing, but he says that that powerful spiritual force can work harm. It can work damage. And in terms of a concrete example, in terms of critiquing Gandhi's approach, I know that there's the suffering of the mill workers in England, presumably due to Gandhi's boycott. Aurobindo doesn't bring that example up because that hasn't happened yet. But a few years later, he'll talk about, Gandhi's boycott in Gujarat in terms of the mill workers. And then okay, 2 minutes left. All right. So just tell me when it's time and then I'll stop. Okay, and then his third point is that, look at nonviolent movements. Gandhi valorizes sacrifice. Gandhi valorizes suffering. He says that the suffering is something that you embrace. And he said, Aurobindo said that's a glorification of violence. And, just as Christianity, glorifying Jesus Christ on the cross, that's a glorification of violence. And look what happened in Christianity. In the early times, it was pacifistic. Later, Christianity itself became the persecutor. And so his point here is that you're never going to escape violence. And so the best policy is just to look violence straight in the face and, use it when it's called for. So my final 2 points here, he wasn't saying that, Indians should use violence against the British. He wasn't commenting about what direction the Indian independence movement should go in. In fact, at this point, it seems that he thought it should go in a nonviolent direction. His point is that nonviolence just simply shouldn't be an absolute principle. That's his point, that it shouldn't be an absolute principle. And I suppose, how much time do I have left? All right, so this is just one point that I pull out. What he essentially says here is that, sure, ahimsa, non-injury, is an Indian value. And he says Gandhi absolutizes it, but it was never meant to be something absolutized. And I can go into that further, but I really want to keep in my time. So that's my talk. Thank you.
All right, thanks so much to our speakers. Sorry there wasn't time for more questions, but I'm going to turn the camera so folks on Zoom can see the audience a little bit, and happy to take any questions.
And I'll stick around afterwards too.
Yep.
Question. So those were his thoughts on Gandhi. Did Gandhi have any thoughts about him?
Well, good question.
Do you want to share so we can?
Okay, sure. So the question is, what were Gandhi's thoughts about
Aurobindo? And Aurobindo really removed himself from the political scene. And part of it too is that he didn't want to get the ashram entangled in contemporary politics. So he has made a point of not being a political figure. And at the same time, there are overtures. It seems that Gandhi made an overture to Aurobindo wanting to meet him. Pandit Nehru definitely made at least one overture to Aurobindo. But since Aurobindo really wasn't a player anymore, it doesn't seem that Gandhi paid much attention to him. However, there were other people who made the type of points that Aurobindo made, and Gandhi is responding to those other points. And so all of this I'm working into a book, and that's in that part of the book, that's what I'll be looking at, how he addressed other people who were making critiques similar to Aurobindo.
I think we should mute one of these.
Sure.
Can I mute yours and then this?
Okay, I'll go ahead and mute. Yeah, mine is
I just.
All right. Go ahead. Yeah.
So you mentioned that the charges against Aurobindo were dropped, even though his brother was convicted of the terrorist acts. But I know at least one historian, Peter Heath, argues that in fact Aurobindo was guilty. He says it was all a dispute about a handwritten letter where Aurobindo gives the other terrorists the orders. And in the courtroom, they said, we can't be sure this is Aurobindo's writing, but others have said after the fact, this was Aurobindo's writing. But I've always thought, so I don't know if you agree with that or not, but I've always thought that Aurobindo makes that big turn after he's so closely implicated in the terrorism and, the prison sentence and everything. He turns to the spiritual life. And it seems to me that that Gandhi has a critique of Aurobindo implicit in that, because it seems to me that Aurobindo says you've got to use the threat of violence. Show everybody how organized you are by going out there and having huge nonviolent actions, but they'll only get anywhere because you're telling the enemy, see what we can do nonviolently. If you don't give us what we want, then we're going to do violence. And you can tell how violent we could be by how successful we were in nonviolent action. I mean, he has that idea there should be a threat. However, people, his brother and the others, they get swept up, they get large prison sentences. Aurobindo gets so disillusioned with politics. He says, people aren't ready. They don't have enough control. I'm going to give up on politics. Whereas Gandhi keeps going. And I think the fact that Gandhi keeps going and that Gandhi has large satyagraha after large satyagraha for the rest of his life shows the benefits of nonviolence, because too many people are afraid to get involved in a movement that's planning terrorist bombings, and so they withhold their participation. And Gandhi, because he says we're just going to be nonviolent, even though it wasn't 100% nonviolent, but because he says our goal is to be 100% nonviolent, he gets millions of people who are willing to go out there. So I was just wondering I would argue that that is an implicit argument that Gandhi is right and Ghose is wrong. Now you could say, oh, everybody's free to give up politics and go to their ashram, and Ghose did a great job in his ashram. But I think that Gandhi,
Should I say a few things?
Yes, sorry.
All right. Also, number one, I consider Peter Heath to be the world's topmost expert on Aurobindo, and I always bow to his authority. And so, in my book, what Peter Heath says about Aurobindo's involvement or non-involvement with the bombing, that's what I'll present his conclusions in that matter. But the only point here where I would disagree with you is that the secondary literature is always saying, oh, Aurobindo got disillusioned, he got this, he got that. But Aurobindo himself never says that he was disillusioned. Aurobindo always insists that his work was different now. His work was spiritual. And you can say that he was disillusioned, but he never actually says that he was disillusioned. And so, I'll show what the secondary literature says. I'll show what Aurobindo himself claims. And in terms of the Swadeshi movement failing and that whole period failing, the historian Samit Sarkar says that, the key problem is that the Swadeshi movement wasn't able to capture the Muslims, and it led to Hindu-Muslim division. And I'll be saying that Gandhi did a better job of pulling the Muslims into the movement than Aurobindo did. And I think that Gandhi's different approach, his nonviolent approach, was what made him more effective than Aurobindo and company. So what I'm saying is parallel to you, and my only point of disagreement is what Aurobindo himself understood of himself. Sure.
It's interesting how we have Aurobindo sort of seeing the spiritual and the strategic political as bifurcated, right? I mean, that's what all of you are talking about in a way. And that's one of the grand mysteries of nonviolence or of Ahimsa. But and I think what part of the success of Gandhi was he managed to keep them together. These contradictory concepts he brought together. And I think what happened to nonviolence in American like nonviolence training was that when Sharp went to India to study the Indian freedom movement, he got turned off by the overly ritualistic, sort of mostly Hindu, although Gandhi himself insisted that his approach was not, Hindu approach, and he brought in all of these faith traditions. But what Sharp saw there kind of turned him off. He said, well, if people have to buy all the trappings of Hinduism, they're going to miss the point. And so what he did was he secularized Gandhi and systematized it. But then Dr. King baptized him. So Dr. King sort of brought in the Christian rhetoric and sort of refashioned it. So then you still have this tension. Peter Ackerman and Jack Duvall and so on, the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict, who had the money to sort of promote the more strategic side of nonviolence that became the kind of gold standard while the real work was being done by, I think, more by religious people, even institutionally. But I think James Sharp himself, he was like a monk, like his whole life was devoted to promoting nonviolence. And so I think even he himself, I don't think he was aware of it, but I think he was very spiritually nonviolent. And even his own person, I mean, I didn't know him well, but I met him and interacted with him a few times, and he was like this devoted, he was spiritually devoted. He was humble, but he was like, his whole life was devoted to promoting, nonviolent transformation, which was a very spiritual kind of thing. And so we have this real problem with the language.
Yeah, I think that you hit it. That's the point of my.
Which is what you were trying to say.
I think all these people have got captured by the language.
Yeah.
That Sharp thinks nonviolent. Well, in the way we use that in English, it has to do with what's observable, what you can see. And so he decided to put all of his emphasis on that. Say, well, if that's really what's doing the work, then let's focus on that and forget about the spiritual stuff. Not realizing that actually he was the one who was missing the point. And in my estimation, Sharp leaves me cold.
He's missing
To be honest, when I read his stuff, it's like all those techniques and everything. It's like, okay, that might work, it might not. That's what you say, but it doesn't really add up to a philosophy, in my estimation.
I have a question for you, the second speaker. I was fascinated by the Engram charts you wrote up for the plot. So I'm wondering, I was wondering what kinds of activities constitute violence based on the plots you showed us, the Engram plots. What kinds of activities will be considered violence? So how did you measure, violence based on that plot you showed us? So I'll just.
So those plots are just occurrences.
What constitutes an act of violence?
Yeah.
And then for the second speaker, my question would be, how does Martin Luther King Jr. philosophy on nonviolence differ substantially from Gandhi's philosophy, given that they emerge from different historical times, are faced by different circumstances? So how does Martin Luther King's philosophy differ from Gandhi's philosophy? Are there variations in their philosophies and approaches to nonviolence?
Well, that's a great question. I'm not sure I have the total answer that you want, but the way I look at it is that nonviolence is a means that anybody can go back to Gandhi and try to learn from and apply it in their own case. But in every single country and case, people have different goals in particular. So the goals can be different, like Martin Luther King was civil rights, and then later poverty and anti-Vietnam War and so on. But the method of nonviolence, he gained insight from Gandhi. So I think everyone goes back to Gandhi for the nonviolence methods, and then they apply it to their own particular situation, which could have different goals. Maybe related, but not the same. I don't know if I answer your question at all, because I think if you're asking how did they differ in terms of strategy, that's a good question. I'm not sure I have the total answer, but I mean,
Okay, so,
the particular struggle was different.
Yeah, there are scholars who define nonviolence as either principle or active nonviolence. Which is why I'm wondering, given that Gandhi fought against colonialism and he got independence for his people.
Yeah.
But Martin Luther King Jr. was faced by several different challenges in the United States. But he felt that nonviolence, would be the best approach, fight for freedom for African Americans. So I'm wondering if there are slight or huge variations in how the two actors have used nonviolence differently, to achieve certain outcomes.
Well, the goals were different, but I would say they both were internally committed, had an internal commitment to nonviolence as a way of life. And in Gandhi's case, it was Hinduism and other traditions. And in Martin Luther King, it was Christian tradition, but they found something in that tradition in each case that gave them that added inner strength to apply nonviolence and to focus on inner mastery and discipline and so on. So they had the strength to go out in the world and undertake a nonviolent struggle. If that makes sense.
Yeah, what I find also very interesting in Martin Luther King's philosophy, the fact that he says we should, look beyond the perpetrator of injustice and tackle the cause of injustice. So address the injustice and not the perpetrator. So if you wrong me, I shouldn't fight you. Even if you're pointing a gun at me, I shouldn't fight you. I should fight the system. I'm wondering to what extent we can achieve justice. If
Are you asking if justice was part of Gandhi too? Because it was, but in a different way. I mean, there's a lot of versions of justice, injustice in terms of different issues. I don't think I'm answering the question. If anyone else wants to jump in, please.
Yeah, let me cut in for
I'd
one
like to
second.
make a
So
comment.
the next session doesn't start till 10:30. It's about 10 after, but we can use this room if folks would like to stay or folks would like to stay on Zoom. I just also want to let people know we're over time. So if you're one of those folks who doesn't like to slip out and things are going, feel free to do that. But otherwise, we continue the discussion as long as it's okay with the speakers.
I didn't answer the question that you asked of me. The Engram plots are plots of occurrences of words. So the plot is just how many times do violence, structural violence, whatever term it is, appear, relatively speaking, in published books. That's all.
Okay.
Right?
That makes sense.
Certainly.
I wanted to respond to your comment about the relationship in the American nonviolent theory and practice of tactics and spirituality, because I agree that King, as you said, rebaptized and reinfused that Christian tradition, which was limiting in the American case, just as Hinduism had been limited in the Gandhian case. But there's another major strand of nonviolent practice in the US, which is Quakerism, which I think has been more successful than the sort of mainstream Protestantism of King. Quaker nonviolent practice has been much more influential in secular circles, both because there's a whole different Quaker relationship to spirituality and because of a couple people in particular, Bayard Russell, who was a Black gay Quaker, and a socialist who co-authored the first manual for nonviolent action with Marty Oppenheimer, who was a Trotskyite, but a practitioner of nonviolence, among a range of other tactics. And then you had groups like the movement for a new society and folks like George Lakey, again, coming out of a Quaker tradition, but speaking in a secular way that had tremendous influence on not so much the civil rights movement of the 60s and 70s, but MNS set the pattern for a set of nonviolent tactics and practices that was tremendously influential in the anti-nuclear movement and subsequent nonviolent movements. So I think there's a range of ways that people have related, and I think there tends to be a fixation on Gandhian or Kingian spiritual nonviolence that remains limiting today, and the ability to make nonviolence accessible to secular folks and non-spiritual or anti-spiritual folks.
Well, that's Gene Sharp. Yeah.
So I really agree with you on that the movement for new society is very influential, and that's really the tradition that I come out of as an activist. I have to say, though, that style of thinking within activist circles has really declined over the last 20 to 30 years, especially among activists of color. It never really resonated with Black activists. And, really since Stokely Carmichael, there's been another way of thinking about these things among folks of color in the US. And I think partly the way that was all approached by the anti-nuclear movement and the MNS and stuff has been partly responsible for the way that nonviolence has been understood. I make the argument in the paper, has kind of set itself up for failure. That's my view.
I have a question. It really struck me on the Engram how, sin was like a huge thing. It looked like it was probably like the 1880s or something at that point. And then it declined sharply, and there was that shift with the growth of nonviolence.
Yep.
So it's interesting because I know religiosity has probably changed a lot. It's more secular now.
Yep.
But I'm struck by how these figures are typically guided by some sort of spiritual sense of nonviolence. I'm curious if you looked at just general religiosity or trends with religion that might connect to that huge shift in the language we saw.
Yeah, so it does mirror this literature and sociology on secularization, which is a controversial concept, but I think when it's been pared down in the way that I tried to do, I think it's fairly solid. There are some shifts over time, like sin has actually increased since the 60s in English, but only if you look at Google Engram, it's only increased in American English, not in British English.
Wow.
So that reflects the religious revival that occurred in the US, but not in Britain.
I didn't know you could search separately for British English and American.
You said since the 60s or 80s?
Since the 60s.
Is that because of perhaps fundamentalism?
Yeah, right. So there was a religious revival in the US, 70s, 80s. It's declined since then, but the uptick that we see looks like it's mostly due to that because of this difference in the British and the American English.
Well, see, I'm curious now too, because a lot of what's happened is Eastern religions coming over, and some of the people you talked about, Hinduism, Buddhism, informing us. I'm curious now if people are focusing more on like positive terms, nonviolence, compassion, peace versus sin, evil, wicked, things like that.
Well, except violence is also really taken off, right? It's like, that's a really popular term.
True, yeah.
Structural
But,
violence,
if you look
systemic.
at US politics, I hate to bring it up, but with Trump, he obviously has been promoting violence basically, and his followers are, following him based on a big lie that he actually won. It's astounding. I'm very interested in like the whole question of democracy right now, and how do we preserve democracy against right-wing extremism, which is a big issue still in the United States with Trumpism.
Just a quick comment too, when I saw the popularity of the word violence, what came to mind to me is it's almost like the word terrorism or violence now is something people tend to apply to the other side, but not to them. So it's sort of losing that neutrality to a sense. That's how I saw it. It was like, it's like you don't like them, they're violent, but you can do the same thing and you're peaceful.
It's okay.
Right?
Well, except in the, I mean, in the peace studies tradition, it's not, I mean, it's something that we all take responsibility for, right? That
Absolutely, yeah.
it's part of the system, it's part of the structure. So it's not just about saying other people. The thing that's, I think, difficult about violence rhetorically is that because of this ungradedness, it sets us up for sort of endless debates, which we've seen mirrored in all of this, right? Going back to Aurobindo. And if you replace violence and nonviolence with maleficence and beneficence, or malice and benevolence, suddenly a lot of those debates just go away, right? Like, why would we wouldn't be arguing about whether it's a good thing to be beneficent. Nonviolence, for some reason, just it immediately gets into tactical and strategic debates that are kind of unending.
Can I say something from the screen here?
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, I'm calling for something. This is very audacious. What I'm suggesting. I realize that.
I was thinking about Gene. I really like Gene. I like all of the nonviolent work, but I really like the Gene Sharp.
Seems to me it wouldn't solve everything because so many of the armed services all consider themselves beneficent. I mean, you go to Washington DC, they have the big soldier caring for the little child. So I think there would still be a myriad of problems. It may be a little better because you're talking about the intention, and I see you think that nonviolence doesn't, but everyone can still manipulate the idea of, well, when I do this action, I'm being beneficent, and when they do it, they're being maleficent. But it's worth a try. But I wanted to bring up some things, Linda, with your paper, because you had the usual go-to candidates for the main influences of Gandhi. And I think it overlooks, I mean, so often in our history, we overlook the contributions of women, the contributions of people of color. And I think it can be shown that several of them were key influences on Gandhi, even though it is underrepresented in the literature. For example, the British suffragettes were a very important example for Gandhi. And it's mentioned a little bit, James Hunt once wrote an article about it. Guha only mentioned it in one sentence in his huge book, Gandhi Before India. But in 2018, at some 100-year anniversary of something the suffragettes did, he wrote an article. And the thing is, he watched them very keenly. And I think you can find, at least 5 ways in which they influenced his way of running a satyagraha action. And I think they have to be given credit. And there are women in South Africa, in Bloemfontein, who had that big anti-pass protest. They did it non-violently, just like the suffragettes. They filled the jail, they fasted in jail, and it was reported in Gandhi's newspaper just before his big 1913 satyagraha. So that's very important. And if you look at, everyone says he read John Ruskin unto this last, and the next thing you know, he's built Phoenix Settlement, but he built it right next to John Dubé. And John Dubé had just been in the US studying with Booker T. Washington. Nico Slate talks about the influence of Booker T. Washington on Gandhi, as well as the Trappists. It wasn't all John Ruskin. He had a next door neighbor in Inanda who had this community of, Zulu community of Africans who believed in self-reliance, who ran their own newspaper. Gandhi started his own newspaper after Dubé, and so I think it's important that we see him in those contexts as having these other local influences. Tolstoy, Ruskin, yes, but let's mention the others too, because I think it can be argued they're very critical to the development of his tactics.
Mhm.
And then when they're used, it's like Gandhi gets the credit for it and the precursors are not mentioned. You know, just like Martin Luther King gets credit for what the women did in Montgomery before he showed up and stepped into that position of leadership.
Thank you, yeah. I'll talk to you some more about that.
Okay.
Great. Yeah. Good points.
If I may push back a little bit more at Todd on your thinking about a decline of nonviolence. I think that's only partially true, but in terms of this discussion, a key difficulty in broadening the appeal of Gandhi is the conflict between Gandhi's spirituality and Marxists, who I'm not, and anarchists, who I am, having each, for their different reasons, long identified religion, not as a neutral force, but as an authoritarian force and part and parcel of what they were struggling and still are struggling against. And that always made it difficult. So I think some of these other examples.
Well, not all, right? They're Catholic and Christian anarchists.
So, but I think there has been in recent years a resurgence in anarchism, still an undercurrent, but a resurgence in it, and also a resurgence in critique of religion in a way that had faded since sort of the writing out of history of Marxism. But there's a new wave of critique of religion as an authoritarian force. And I think that's a challenge to those who call themselves Gandhians, is how to incorporate a recognition of religious authoritarianism and the evils of religion into something that draws on some other aspects of Gandhi. And I think if that's going to come, it's probably going to come about from, again, new wave anarchism.
Can I reply to you?
No, of course.
No, I mean, what your point is interesting, but I've done a lot of interfaith dialogue, and I have created a diagram that within every religion, you have different possible perspectives. And you have the direct inner experience of someone like a Christ or Buddha or whatever, which is mystical, inner direct experience, which is not, and then after that, you get followers who say, let's start a religion based on those teachings. And then you start to get, norms to live by. And that religion is really social learning. You teach and pass those things down to how to be a good person in that faith tradition. And then over further, you get extremism or dogmatism. And my point is just that every religion has all of those perspectives, and to just critique religion outright, to me, I wouldn't agree with. I think there's aspects of religion that are positive. Absolutely, and then there's other aspects, like even the social learning part, you could, say is maybe limited in certain ways and so on, but it's like values to live by, which is probably better than no values, but but the extremism, dogmatism is a problem in any religion, and I would critique that as much as you would. But on the more direct inner experience, I wouldn't agree with you.
I think you raise a good, interesting point.
I was wondering when you said non-violence is a way of life. And I know Martin Luther King Jr. that view that non-violence is a way of life.
Right.
But I mean, is that way of life a means to an end? I mean, so what ends are we pursuing by using non-violence? Is that an end to peace, or what kind of peace are we pursuing by using non-violence? Approaching it as a way of life. It's what we do every day.
Right.
It's like a norm, but what exactly are we aiming to achieve?
Well, I think in every case, it's a little different, because as I said, the goals of peace in each situation are different. The goals to create a more peaceful situation will vary country by country, group by group, and so on. So you can't say they're always the same. I mean, but creating some harmony in human relations, having some social justice, human rights for everybody, not just the few or the elite. I mean, there's various things you probably find in everyone, but in it, like Gandhi was trying to achieve independence, but he was also helping the poor and the suffering, and so he was involved with a lot of domestic stuff too. And then King was started out being more civil rights domestic, but then became an anti-war, Vietnam advocate as well later. So I mean, I think in each case, the goal of peace would depend on the particular circumstances in each case where there's inequity and injustice. And it wouldn't be the same in each case,
I
but
have a problem where people are coming to you with weapons. No, their intent is to kill you. No. So I say, I have a problem with the situation where people are coming to you with weapons. And their intent is to kill you.
right. Oh,
I mean,
but I think
so,
even Gandhi,
yeah.
didn't he say
And
you
you're
have a right to
fighting-
defend
And
yourself?
you're fighting
Yeah.
Yeah,
without weapons, defenseless, if you're
Right.
going to kill defenseless people with weapons.
no, I
So-
hear what you're saying.
So
And I-
how can non-violence be a way of life? It means, okay, we're going to surrender ourselves to death.
Yeah,
You can kill us so long as we are pursuing non-violence, even though
yeah.
we are seeking justice.
No, I think that I think Gandhi himself even said there's an exception of nonviolence. If your life is threatened, you have a right to defend yourself.
Yeah.
Other people can speak up. So I would agree with you. I mean, in that sense, he's not saying it's absolute in every situation, but you do have a right to survive and live and defend yourself. There's a difference probably using violence to defend yourself if someone else is attacking you as opposed to using violence to attack someone else.
Yeah. I think that the whole kind of Gandhian, the principled versus strategic distinction that's
Right.
often drawn, to me is kind of missing the more important distinction between Gandhi and Sharp, which is this mental dimension. Because Gandhi was very equivocal actually in his writing and his life when it came to violence. There are all kinds of exceptions in his writing and in his life. And Sharp doesn't say very explicitly in parts that I've read, nonviolent action is something you can come or go. He's pretty committed to it. So I think they're both principled in a way, just what it means to them is different. For Gandhi, it really has to do with your intentions and your mental state. And Sharp just didn't think that was important. I don't know why that is. I mean, I don't know enough about Sharp's personal history or biography to understand why he included that. But the language may be part of it.
So on that note, I just want to remind everybody the plenary is about to start in like 3 minutes downstairs.
I think that's a really good point.
So, you know, something I never, so.
I had seen your face on the Zoom yesterday. I didn't know I was
Yeah, now I'm
going to be here as a person.
You might want
Escaping a complete week.
yes, right. That actually, well,
to.
I was still there for unfortunately for.
You just come
You
up
might want
with
to end the
I
Zoom.
came yesterday.
Yeah, because it's going to pick up everything.
So I actually
Thanks,
listened
everybody
in
on Zoom.
as I was traveling.
What's that?
I was on Zoom as I was traveling yesterday.
Oh, I see. All right.
So I wasn't able.
Articulated the way secondary literature always articulated that, he gave off to his disillusion, this, that.
Yeah,
But that's what
seems like I
he does
mostly
explain
talk to you at
himself,
these
what he believes in himself is that his work is different.
Well, I know,
Really breaks down the
I know you're in the different, we don't see each other that often for some reason. I don't know your schedules or if you're down at Stanford or whatever. Are you back on campus? Or-
I am back, yeah, it's twice a week now.
But I mean, he's
2 days a
had a big
week.
influence on
2
his
days,
future evolution.
But I'm still on mute, probably for the duration. How are you doing?
Thank you again.
Oh, I actually stopped the recording.